All right, so this will be a much shorter discussion this time, or lecture this time, about what's going to happen. So when Mrs. Carey is done with this video, she's going to tell you to get your computers out and start working on some things. But don't do that yet. Right now, just know that I have shared a document with you called Us and Them Confronting Labels and Lies. This document has 4 parts to it. Well, really only 3 parts, but parts 1 and 1A are kind of the same thing, but they're different, so that's why they are here. So it's a very simple process. You're going to do part 1, part 1A. That'll take you 7 to 10 minutes. You're going to do part 2, which will take you another 2 to 3 minutes. So Mrs. Carey is going to give you about 12 or 13 minutes to work on this in your pod. So as a pod, you can all have the same answers. Everyone's doing their own worksheet, but you can all kind of discuss the answers and look at the pictures and kind of work through this process. So it's very simple. Part 1, after looking at these pictures, so you click on this document, you click on those pictures, and it'll take you to a presentation, a Google presentation. That presentation has anywhere from 5 to 10 pictures on it. Then you answer these 3 questions. Then there's another presentation with different photos that you use for these 4 questions. Then you click on these maps, and that will take you to the idea of what these maps are for the Google presentation, for another Google presentation, to kind of help you understand kind of what we're trying to shoot for here, for why, how are they the same and how are they different, for this idea of Jews versus us and them. Now, that'll take you 10 to 12 minutes. You should easily get done with that here in the next 10, 12 minutes. Part 3 down here is Jews are inferior to Aryans. This is your homework for tomorrow. So what you're going to do is you're going to be looking at these 3 statements. Then you're going to answer these 2 questions based on these 3 statements. So how do those statements come into play? And this is going to be 1 or 2 sentences, maybe 3 or 4 sentences. This is not going to be a huge paragraph, small paragraph perhaps, but not a huge paragraph down here for these 2. And that's your homework. If you get that done in class, great. But I'm going to tell Mrs. Carey to pause this right now so that I can build in the lecture that needs to happen after you do parts 1 and 2. Then I'll do a brief lecture, and then part 3 will be your homework. So here's your brief lecture. A lot of times students ask why the Jews were victims of discrimination in Europe. Why the Jews? Now, we talked yesterday and Friday last week about how that built up to the point of World War II. And really, to fully understand this question, we need to kind of look at that history of anti-Semitism, which really the term for anti-Semitism really didn't even become a thing until the 1850s. But anyway, because Jews had lived as a minority for so long and had such different traditions and beliefs than the majority of Christians living in Western Europe, Jews had been the victims of labels and lies for centuries. Like Thomas of Monmouth talking about this massive conspiracy to execute a Christian in Europe. All of those things were just untrue lies, but they were lies that were perpetuated as fact. And so what we really need to understand is that most of the hatred of the Jews in Germany in World War II happened as a result of lies that had been told for decades, dating back to the 1880s. Okay? The biggest fault here, the biggest lie that happened in this time period is a lie told in the late 1800s that Jews belong to an inferior race. Because as you saw in parts 1 and 2, Jews really aren't a race, they are people. They get married, they serve their country in the military, they do lots of different things. But this lie of Jews as an inferior racial group, this lie then becomes the evidence that Nazis used towards Jews over time. And policies that are put in place by Nazi government that are anti-Semitic, that pick on the Jews, that isolate the Jews, that ultimately result in the extermination of 2/3 of Europe's Jews. Now, in order to understand this lie, we're going to look at these expressions down here in part 3, which are right over here, down here in part 3. And they're going to express certain views of Germans in the early 20th century. Now, you have to understand, these views of Germans are not unique to Germany. They're found in Europe. They're found in France. They're found in England, the United States. One of Hitler's biggest fans in the United States was Charles Lindbergh, the famous pilot who flew the first plane across the Atlantic solo. He was one of Hitler's biggest fans. He liked a lot of things that Hitler was saying about the purity of the Aryan race and the inferiority of the Jews, and very publicly, vocally expressed that support for Hitler. So when we think about this idea, we need to understand that this is a view of 20th century people, whether they be German, British, French, Americans, Russians. We saw what they did in the pogroms. So many of you may not be familiar with that idea, but many of you are. So we need to really understand that concept. And so these facts are put into place about anti-Semitism based upon myths, lies, and stories that were created in the 1800s to kind of continue this tradition that we had seen of Jews as other. So that gives you the facts that you need to know here for part 3. So now we've got part 1, part 1A, part 2. They should be done. If not, finish those up. And then part 3. This whole thing needs to be done for Wednesday when you come to class. Thanks, and have a nice day.